I'm not a stranger to the late-night shifts at the gas station. There's a rhythm to it. The hum of fluorescent lights, the steady ping of the door sensor, the muffled drone of passing cars. It's a strange sort of peace, the kind you can only find at 2 a.m. when the world feels like it's holding its breath. But that night was different. It started as a quiet shift, even by my usual standards. The regulars, truck drivers stopping for coffee, a couple of teenagers grabbing snacks, came and went. By midnight, it was just me and the aisles of brightly lit junk food. That's when I noticed it. A car, a dark sedan, idling at the edge of the parking lot. It was parked in the farthest spot, almost hidden in the shadows where the overhead light had long since burned out. I wouldn't have thought much of it, but the car just sat there, engine running, headlights off. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone was taking a break or making a phone call. But after 15 minutes, it started to feel off. I glanced at the clock, 12:17 a.m., and decided to keep an eye on it. The car didn't move. By 12:30, my nerves were starting to get the better of me. I stepped outside under the pretense of taking out the trash, the cold air biting against my skin. From the doorway, I squinted toward the car. The windows were tinted, too dark to make out the driver. Still, I felt eyes on me, like whoever was inside was watching. I shoved the trash bag into the dumpster and headed back inside, locking the door behind me. The car remained. Around 1 a.m., another customer finally showed up, a man in a hoodie and jeans, just looking for a pack of cigarettes. I took my time ringing him up, trying to act casual as I peeked over his shoulder at the parking lot. The sedan was still there, still silent, still ominous. "Everything okay?" the man asked, catching my glance. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a long night." He nodded, paid, and left. I watched as he walked to his truck and drove away, half hoping the sight of another vehicle might scare off whoever was lurking in that sedan. It didn't. The car stayed. By 1:45, the anxiety was gnawing at me. I tried to focus on stocking shelves, wiping counters, anything to keep my hands busy, but my eyes kept drifting to the security monitors. The car was just barely visible on the edge of the screen, a shadowy outline that felt more threatening with each passing minute. At 2 a.m., the car finally moved. I froze as its engine revved, the sound low and deliberate. It rolled forward slowly, pulling closer to the store. The headlights stayed off, which somehow made it worse. It came to a stop about halfway across the lot, directly under one of the working lights. For the first time, I got a good look at it, a black sedan, nondescript but clean. Too clean. Not the kind of car you'd expect to see at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. My heart was pounding now. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There's a car in the parking lot. It wasn't illegal to sit in your car, even if it was creepy as hell. Still, I grabbed my phone and dialed anyway, hesitating just before hitting call. That's when the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't look at the store, didn't look at me. Instead, he walked around to the trunk, moving slowly, deliberately. I watched as he opened it and leaned inside. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he getting a tire iron? A gun? When he straightened up, he was holding a gas can. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The man started walking toward the store, the gas can swinging casually at his side. Something about the way he moved put me on edge, too calm, too purposeful. He reached the door and tried to open it, frowning when he realized it was locked. I hesitated, debating whether to let him in. He gestured toward the gas can, then pointed to his car. I grabbed the intercom. "We're prepay only at night," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded and pulled out his wallet, holding up a 20. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. He stepped inside, and I caught a whiff of something strange, chemical, almost metallic. "Pump 2, he said, placing the 20 on the counter. I nodded, rang him up, and watched as he walked back outside. He didn't go straight to the pump, though. Instead, he paused by the door, glancing inside. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made your stomach drop, cold and calculating. He turned and walked to his car, filling up the gas can as I stood frozen behind the counter. When he was done, he placed the can in his trunk, got back in the driver's seat, and drove away without another glance. The lot was empty again, but the unease lingered. I didn't relax until the morning sun started to creep over the horizon, the shadows retreating with the light. I told myself it was over, just a weird encounter, nothing more. Hours later, as I was cleaning up, I realized I hadn't even noticed a small object left behind by the pump. A woman's scarf, neatly folded, lay where the man had briefly stood. It wasn't anything remarkable, plain, dark fabric, but the sight of it unsettled me. No women had been in the store that night, and I couldn't think of any reason why he'd have dropped it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Had it fallen out of his trunk when he opened it? My mind wandered to what else might have been in there. Was someone in the trunk? Or was I just letting my imagination get the better of me? I stood there for a long moment, staring at the scarf, the unease crawling up my spine. But in the end, I told myself it didn't matter. I folded the scarf neatly and placed it in the lost and found box, locking up for the day. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. But the truth was, I'd never know. And maybe that was for the best. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. Working security at a shipping yard isn't glamorous, but it's steady. The hours are long and lonely, but I don't mind. The place is huge, a maze of shipping containers and dark corners, but I know it like the back of my hand. Most nights are quiet until they're not. It was just past midnight when I heard the knock on the office door. The sharp rap startled me. No one ever came by this late. I glanced at the monitors, but there was no sign of anyone. When I opened the door, a man stood there, flashing a badge so quickly I barely had time to read it. He looked official enough, mid-40s, a neatly pressed jacket, a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Inspector Carter," he said briskly. "Routine inspection. Didn't anyone tell you I'd be coming?" I frowned. No, I wasn't told about any inspection. He sighed like this wasn't the first time it had happened. Typical. "Look, I'm just here to do my rounds, won't take long." Something about him didn't sit right with me. His badge looked real, but the way he held it, like he didn't want me to get a good look, made me suspicious. Still, I didn't want to cause trouble if he was legitimate. "All right," I said reluctantly. "I'll have to escort you." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and we set off. As we walked, Carter asked questions: how often the yard was patrolled, how many cameras were operational, whether we kept a record of vehicle traffic. His tone was casual, almost friendly, but there was an edge to it, like he already knew the answers. When we reached the storage containers, he stopped and scanned the rows with a practiced eye. "Mind if I take a closer look here?" I hesitated. "What are you looking for exactly?" "Standard checks," he said vaguely, already walking toward one of the containers. I followed, my unease growing. He examined the locks, shining a flashlight on them, muttering to himself. At one container, he crouched down, running his fingers along the bottom edge like he was looking for something specific. "What's in here?" he asked. "Standard cargo," I said. "Mostly machinery and equipment. We don't open containers without authorization." He stood up, brushing off his hands. "Right? Of course." He continued through the yard, his questions becoming more pointed. Had there been any recent break-ins? Were there blind spots in the camera coverage? Was I alone on the shift? The last question made my stomach tighten. "Why do you ask?" "Just part of the protocol," he said with a thin smile. By the time we finished, I was more suspicious than ever. He didn't ask to check my logbook or review any documentation, things a real inspector would have done. And his badge, now that I thought about it, I couldn't even remember the agency he claimed to represent. As we headed back to the office, he slowed, glancing at the dark rows of containers one last time. "Looks good," he said, his tone too casual. "Thanks for your cooperation." I nodded stiffly, watching as he walked to the gate. He didn't have a car parked nearby, which struck me as odd. Inspectors always arrived in marked vehicles. Once he was out of sight, I went back to the monitors, rewinding the footage from earlier in the night. The cameras showed him approaching the office, but not from the gate. He'd come from inside the yard. My heart sank. I scanned through more footage, checking the time before he'd shown up. At 11:30 p.m., there he was, slipping between rows of containers, moving quickly and deliberately. He hadn't been inspecting, he'd been searching for something. Or someone. Just as I was reaching for the phone to call my supervisor, something on the screen caught my eye. One of the containers, the one Carter had been so interested in, had its lock hanging loose. It had been secured earlier in the night. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight and headed back out. The air was cold, the yard eerily quiet. When I reached the container, I shined my light on the lock. It wasn't broken, it had been picked. I pushed the heavy door open, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, it was mostly empty, save for a pile of discarded packing materials and a jacket lying on the floor. I crouched down, picking it up carefully. It was small, bright red, the kind of color that stood out even in the dim light. It looked out of place, dirty and torn at the seams. I felt a chill. I recognized it. A few nights earlier, a woman in a red jacket had come by, frantic and out of breath. She'd said she was being followed, begged to use the phone. I'd let her, but she'd left before the police arrived, too scared to wait. Now, holding the jacket, I realized she might not have gotten far. Back at the office, I called the police, reporting the break-in and everything I'd found. They arrived quickly, their questions sharp and unrelenting. I told them about Carter, describing him in as much detail as I could. But when I mentioned the badge, the clipboard, the questions, the lead officer shook his head. "No inspector by that name," he said, "and no agency scheduled for inspections tonight." As they began their investigation, one of the officers pulled me aside. "You did good calling us," he said quietly. "If he was here for that woman, you might have stopped him from finding her." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. The yard was quiet again when the officers left, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I sat in the office, staring at the monitors, replaying every moment in my head. Carter, or whoever he was, had come looking for something that night. And though he'd left empty-handed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be back. It was the first night of my shift at Rosewood Care Home, a facility for the elderly tucked away in the quieter part of town. The usual staff was on leave, and I had been called in as a substitute nurse. The residents were already asleep when I arrived. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a combination of cleaning products and air fresheners meant to mask the facility's underlying age. "Most nights are quiet," said Karen, the nurse I was covering for, as she handed me a clipboard with the residents' notes. "But keep an eye on Mr. Hargrove in room 12. He's prone to wandering." I nodded and took a seat at the nursing station, which overlooked a long hallway lined with doors. The only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. By midnight, I'd finished my initial rounds. Most residents were sound asleep, save for the occasional snore or murmur. At around 2 a.m., the motion sensor light at the end of the hallway flicked on. I glanced up from my charting and saw a figure shuffling past room 8. Assuming it was Mr. Hargrove, I stood and followed. "Mr. Hargrove?" I called softly, not wanting to wake anyone else. The figure turned the corner. When I reached the end of the hall, I expected to find him near the common room, but it was empty. Puzzled, I checked the residents' doors. Everyone was accounted for, including Mr. Hargrove, who was snoring loudly in his bed. I chalked it up to exhaustion and returned to my station. By 3 a.m., I was restless. I decided to do another round, partly to stretch my legs and partly to assure myself that I hadn't imagined the earlier incident. As I passed room 9, I noticed the door to room 14 was slightly ajar. That was unusual. Residents' doors were always closed at night to maintain privacy and minimize noise. I peeked inside. The room was dark, the bed neatly made, and the bathroom door open with the light off. According to the clipboard, room 14 belonged to a resident named Eleanor Blake, but her name had been crossed out, and the space was listed as vacant. Strange. I made a mental note to ask about it during the morning handover. For now, I closed the door and continued my rounds. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling that lingered from the open door. The next night, the shift started the same way. I was alone by 10 p.m., reviewing medication charts and vitals. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps. This time, I immediately stood and walked down the hall. I caught a glimpse of the figure disappearing around the corner toward room 14. My pulse quickened as I followed. The door to room 14 was ajar again. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The room was empty. The bed was still neatly made, the bathroom door still open. I checked the closet and under the bed, feeling foolish but unsettled. I closed the door and double-checked that it latched securely. As I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A faint impression on the chair by the window, as if someone had recently been sitting there. The cushion slowly regained its shape. I froze, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. When I returned to the nursing station, I pulled out the clipboard and flipped to the page listing room 14. Eleanor Blake's name was still crossed out, but the notes mentioned she had passed away 2 weeks ago. Her belongings had been removed, and the room was listed as ready for a new resident. My throat tightened as I read the last line. Known for wandering at night. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Old habits don't fade quickly, even when the resident is gone. Maybe the night staff hadn't fully cleared the room yet. The following night, I arrived determined to put my unease behind me. Still, I couldn't help but keep an eye on room 14 during my rounds. At 1:30 a.m., the motion sensor light near the end of the hall turned on again. This time, I stayed at the station and watched. The figure appeared briefly, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of an elderly person. It paused outside room 14 before slipping inside. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried down the hall. The door was ajar again. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The chair by the window was empty, but a faint scent lingered in the air, a floral perfume, faint but distinct. My pulse pounded as I checked every corner of the room. Nothing. I decided then and there to review the security footage. The camera outside room 14 showed the hallway clearly. At 1:30 a.m., the motion sensor light flicked on, but the hallway was empty. No figure, no door opening or closing. Just me arriving moments later. I didn't sleep that morning when I got home. Instead, I researched Eleanor Blake. She had been a long-term resident at Rosewood, known for her nightly wanderings and fondness for sitting by the window to watch the stars. She had no family and had died peacefully in her sleep. I debated whether to bring it up to the staff during the next shift change, but decided against it. I didn't want to sound paranoid or disrespectful. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still occupying room 14. On my final night shift that week, I made one last round before dawn. As I passed room 14, the door was closed, just as I'd left it. But this time, I noticed something chilling on the inside of the window. A single handprint, faint and smudged, pressed against the glass. It hadn't been there before. When the morning staff arrived, I handed over my notes and left without mentioning the incident. As I walked to my car, I glanced back at the building. The window in room 14 caught the first rays of sunlight, and for a moment I thought I saw the faintest shadow of someone sitting there, watching me leave.